CM Punk, the modern era's least prepared fighter. By the time CM Punk walked into the UFC, the game had already evolved past anything resembling a fair debut for a complete beginner. This wasn't 1993 anymore. This was the Reebok era UFC. Fighters were cross-training in Muay Thai, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, and strength and conditioning from day one. Even the so-called prospects had years of amateur fights under their belts before Dana White ever called their name. CM Punk, he had wrestling, the scripted kind. When the UFC announced the signing of Phil Brooks, better known to WWE fans as CM Punk, in late 2014, it was marketed as a dream come true story, a man chasing a new challenge. But in MMA reality, it was the equivalent of throwing someone who just learned how to doggy paddle into the middle of the Pacific Ocean. He trained with Duke Rufus at Rufusport for nearly 2 years before his debut. On paper, that sounded like a serious camp. In practice, it was a crash course in survival. Punk was 37 years old. He had never competed in any combat sport. Not boxing, not kickboxing, not amateur MMA. The UFC wasn't just giving him a debut, they were handing him one of the most visible stages in the sport, UFC 203 on pay-per-view. His opponent, Mickey Gall, a young, legitimate brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, handpicked via Dana White's Looking for a Fight series. Gall was supposed to be winnable, in the same way a wolf might be winnable for a house cat. 15 seconds in, Punk overcommitted on a straight right, got double-legged clean to the mat, and from there it was like watching a mechanic dismantle an engine. Gall passed his guard effortlessly, smashed from mount, took his back, and choked him out in 2 minutes and 14 seconds. Punk didn't land a single significant strike. The UFC could have quietly closed the book there, but spectacle is a currency, so they booked him again at UFC 225. This time against Mike Jackson, a 1-1 fighter who had also lost to Gall. This was billed as a fairer matchup. In reality, it was worse. Jackson outstruck Punk at will for all 3 rounds, but never bothered to finish him. Instead, showboating, grinning, and dragging the fight out. Punk lost a 30-26 unanimous decision, and looked every bit the man who had never belonged in the cage in the first place. By modern standards, CM Punk was the least prepared fighter to ever step into the octagon. No early era chaos to hide behind. No mystery about what worked in MMA. Just a name, a hope, and a marketing experiment that played out in real time. In a rare crossover of worlds, The Undertaker appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience and reflected on CM Punk's leap into the UFC. He called it a crazy gamble, admitting he never fully understood the move. Punk had been one of WWE's top stars, but with tensions between him and the company, perhaps he was searching for a new challenge. Even so, Undertaker believed the timing was all wrong. Punk didn't have the background for MMA, and making that transition so late in his athletic career was always going to be an uphill battle. Mike Jackson, the man who beat Punk and made everyone mad. If CM Punk's UFC run was the setup, Mike Jackson was supposed to be the punchline. He was never meant to be a future contender. In fact, Jackson's UFC call-up was engineered as a plot device. Back in early 2016, Dana White's Looking for a Fight reality series needed an opponent for Mickey Gall, a promising young prospect who had publicly called out Punk. Gall's opponent had to be someone UFC could sign for one fight, lose gracefully, and help create a narrative. That man was Mike Jackson. Jackson came in 0-0 as a pro, with a short amateur career and a background in boxing and kickboxing. He wasn't a total stranger to combat sports. He'd done media work for MMA outlets and fought on the regional scene, but he was hardly UFC ready in the conventional sense. He faced Gall at UFC Fight Night 82 in February 2016, and the plan worked perfectly. Gall dropped Jackson with the first punch he threw, submitted him in 45 seconds, and used the post-fight mic to demand CM Punk. Fast forward to 2018, and Jackson was back in the octagon, this time across from Punk himself at UFC 225. On paper, this was the fairest matchup possible. 2 men who had lost to the same opponent, neither with a UFC win. In practice, it turned into one of the most frustrating fights in modern UFC history. Jackson dominated from the opening bell. He jabbed Punk at will, slipped nearly every wild punch, and controlled every exchange. But instead of putting him away, Jackson coasted, smiling, talking, and deliberately drawing the fight out over 3 lopsided rounds. He won 30-26 on all scorecards, but the performance drew the wrath of Dana White, who blasted him in the post-fight press conference. That guy's acting like a goofball. That was a joke. You get that opportunity to fight on a stage like this, and you go out and do that. That's not what we're looking for. The UFC quietly released Jackson after the fight, only bringing him back once in 2021, when he faced Dean Barry in a bizarre bout that ended in a disqualification win for Jackson due to repeated fouls. It was his last UFC appearance. James Toney boxing royalty meets MMA reality. By 2010, James Lights Out Toney was already a boxing legend, multiple-time world champion across 3 weight divisions, over 80 professional fights, known for his slick defense, granite chin, and old-school trash talk. He was a master of the sweet science. What he wasn't, in any way, was an MMA fighter. But in the late 2000s, a quiet feud was brewing between boxing loyalists and the rising MMA audience. Each side claimed superiority, and Toney, never shy about his opinion, decided to test it. He confronted Dana White in person after UFC 108, accusing the UFC boss of disrespecting boxers. Toney pressed him for a fight, insisting he could hang with the best. Dana, always open to a spectacle if the math made sense, eventually gave in and paired Toney against Randy Couture at UFC 118 in August 2010. On paper, it looked like a freak show. In reality, it was a public service announcement about what happens when you cross into a different sport without preparation. Toney had no amateur wrestling base, no grappling credentials, and had only been dabbling in MMA training for a few months. Couture, meanwhile, was a former 2-division UFC champion, an Olympic-level Greco-Roman wrestler, and one of the most respected tacticians in the sport's history. The fight lasted 3 minutes and 19 seconds, and most of that was Couture methodically setting up the finish. 10 seconds in, Randy ducked under a punch, scored a double-leg takedown, and from there it was academic. Toney was smothered, mounted, and eventually submitted with an arm triangle choke. Afterward, Couture praised Toney's courage for stepping in at all, but the lesson was clear. Crossing from boxing into MMA without a complete skill set is like showing up to a chess match knowing only how to play checkers. Toney never fought in MMA again, but his UFC cameo became a cultural moment. It was marketed as a battle of worlds, but in execution, it was a one-sided reminder. In the cage, the ground game is king. Joe Son, the infamous UFC 4 debut. If there's such a thing as a so bad it's unforgettable fight in MMA history, Joe Son's UFC debut at UFC 4 is in that category. Son walked into the octagon in December 1994 with the confidence of a man who thought he'd invented a martial art. Literally. He called it Joe Son-do, a blend of techniques he claimed to have created himself. To the MMA world, it was an early warning sign. His entrance was as bizarre as his skill set, inspired by his friend and fellow fighter Kimo Leopoldo, who had carried a giant wooden cross to the cage earlier that year. Son decided to do the same. The difference? Leopoldo was strong enough to make it look imposing. Son nearly collapsed under the weight before he even made it to the octagon, visibly gassing out before the fight had begun. Once the bout started, things went from odd to downright painful. Facing Keith Hackney, Son was quickly taken down and trapped in a compromising position. What followed is one of the most infamous sequences in UFC history. Hackney unleashed a barrage of legal at the time groin strikes, repeated brutal shots until Son collapsed in agony and was forced to submit. It was over in just over 2 minutes, and Son's brief UFC career was effectively finished before it began. Years later, Joe Son became notorious for reasons far beyond MMA, as his name surfaced in connection with serious criminal convictions. Those events have nothing to do with his UFC performance, but they cemented his place in the villain category for many fans. In the cage, though, his legacy is frozen in that one bizarre night in Tulsa, a failed homemade martial art, a botched dramatic entrance, and a finish so infamous it's still replayed in highlight reels, usually as the example of why groin shots were eventually banned. Thomas Ramirez, the 200-0 Mystery Man. Every so often in the UFC's early years, a fighter would show up with a record so outrageous it practically dared the audience to believe it. Thomas Ramirez was one of those cases. When Ramirez stepped into the cage at UFC 8 in 1996, he was announced as an undefeated fighter with a record of 200 wins and 0 losses. No video evidence, no verified opponents, just a perfect, impossibly round number that made even the most generous matchmaker raise an eyebrow. The truth? Ramirez was a 41-year-old, 400 410-pound taxi driver from Puerto Rico. His listed martial art was Pakuachan, a style so obscure that most fans had never heard of it, with one broadcast commentator claiming Jet Li had trained in it for film roles. His fight resume outside the UFC, largely a mystery. His opponent that night was Don Fry, a legitimate wrestler, striker, and one of the most dangerous men in the sport at the time. The matchup was over before it began. Fry slipped a punch, landed a clean right hand, and knocked Ramirez out 8 seconds into the fight. It remains one of the fastest KOs in UFC history. That was the entirety of Ramirez's MMA career. No comeback fights, no regional circuit rebuild, just a single blink and you miss it loss and a legendary fight record claim that has never been substantiated. In the Wild West era of MMA, Thomas Ramirez was a perfect example of the sport's early unpredictability. You never knew if the next guy walking to the cage was a hidden assassin or a cab driver with a made-up win streak. Andy Anderson, the 86-0 nude steakhouse champion. In the early days of the UFC, fight records were often taken at face value. A man could claim he was undefeated in 50, 60, even 80 fights, and unless someone in the back knew better, it went into the broadcast. But even by that standard, Andy Anderson's resume raised eyebrows. When Anderson debuted at UFC 5 in 1995, the tale was this. He was an 86-0 knockout artist and a 5th degree Taekwondo black belt. It sounded impressive, if you didn't stop to wonder why no one had ever heard of him. The truth behind the fighter was even stranger. Anderson wasn't a fixture in martial arts gyms. He was the owner of a Texas restaurant called the Totally Nude Steakhouse, exactly what the name suggests. His connection to the UFC, he had previously supplied ring girls to the promotion. Somewhere along the way, he decided that the next logical step was stepping into the cage himself. His opponent was John Hess, a 6'7" brawler known for his wild, rule-bending fighting style. The result was quick and ugly. Anderson was overpowered from the opening bell, battered by knees, and stopped in under 2 minutes. If he landed a clean punch, no one remembers it. It was his only MMA fight. Anderson never returned to the cage, but his post-fight headlines weren't done. Years later, he would be convicted in connection with a methamphetamine trafficking and money laundering ring, maintaining his innocence but serving time nonetheless. Sean Ganon, the Kimbo Slayer experiment. By the mid-2000s, the UFC was no longer the Wild West, but it was still willing to gamble on spectacle, and few names had more internet buzz in 2004 than Kimbo Slice, the street-fighting YouTube phenomenon whose bare-knuckle brawls were racking up millions of views before viral was even a word. Enter Sean Ganon, a Boston police officer and part-time MMA fighter. Ganon made his name in the underground scene by doing what no one else had done, beating Kimbo in an unsanctioned, taped fight that spread across the internet like wildfire. It wasn't a polished MMA performance, but it was enough to crown him the guy who beat Kimbo. The UFC saw an opportunity. In 2005, they signed Ganon for a one-off fight at UFC 55, pairing him with Brandon Lee Hinkle, an NCAA Division I wrestler on an 8-fight win streak who had already fought seasoned pros around the world. For anyone who followed the sport closely, it was a mismatch from the announcement. On fight night, the hype died fast. Hinkle took Ganon down almost immediately, and from there, the fight was one-sided. Ganon was pinned, smothered, and pounded with strikes until the referee stepped in late in the first round. It was Ganon's first and last UFC fight. He never fought professionally again, but his place in MMA history was sealed, a living example of the gap between street fighting fame and the unforgiving structure of the octagon. The UFC had gambled that the Kimbo Slayer mystique would sell, and it did, but in the cage, the experiment ended in a reality check. Fred Ettish, from meme to redemption. If you were an early UFC fan, Fred Ettish was a name you probably heard for all the wrong reasons. His debut at UFC 2 in March 1994 became one of the sport's first viral moments, long before the internet made that a thing. Ettish was a traditional martial artist, a karate practitioner with decades of training, but almost no real-world combat experience. In the early 90s, that was more common than you might think. Many martial artists had never been tested under full contact conditions, let alone in an open rules MMA environment. On fight night, Ettish faced Johnny Rhodes, a boxer and kickboxer with actual professional fight experience. The difference was clear from the opening seconds. Rhodes tagged Ettish with a stiff right hand that nearly blinded him in one eye. a lingering injury he would later confirm to be permanent damage to his vision. From there, it was a downhill spiral. Ettish was battered with what were then legal knees to the head on the ground before being caught in a choke and tapped out. The image of him lying bloodied on the canvas became an early UFC meme, replayed on VHS tapes, mocked in martial arts circles, and used as proof that traditional arts couldn't survive in MMA. For years, Ettish endured online ridicule, but his story didn't end there. He faced devastating personal tragedy with the loss of his son, kept training, and, at age 53, returned to the cage in 2009, winning a regional MMA fight by submission. Fred Ettish will always be remembered for that rough night in 1994, but his later comeback reframed the narrative. What started as one of MMA's earliest worst fighter moments became something else entirely, proof that sometimes the punchline can fight back. Ryan Parker, the pressure point master who got choked out. The mid-90s were a strange time for martial arts. The UFC was still new, and the world was full of experts who swore their style could handle anything, if only they got the chance to prove it. Ryan Parker was one of them. When Parker entered UFC 7 in 1995, his resume sounded like something out of a martial arts magazine ad. A third-degree black belt in Okawa karate, a master of pressure point striking, and, according to him, trained in breathing techniques that made it impossible to choke him out. Backstage before the fight, he reportedly told Gerard Gordeau, the Dutch kickboxer infamous from UFC 1, all about these skills. Gordeau, who'd seen plenty of tough men humbled in a fight, was skeptical. Parker's opponent that night was Remco Pardoel, a legitimate martial artist with black belts in judo, taekwondo, Japanese jiu-jitsu, and eventually Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Pardoel was no world champion, but he was the real deal. A large, strong heavyweight who'd already beaten 2 men in one night at UFC 2 before facing Royce Gracie. Once the bell rang, Parker's theories met reality. Pardoel took him down almost immediately, worked to a dominant position, and, in a twist of poetic irony, submitted him with a choke in just over 3 minutes. The impossible to choke claim didn't survive the first round. After the fight, Gordeau reportedly approached Parker with the only post-mortem needed: "How did those pressure point techniques work out for you?" Jason Thacker, the reality TV sacrificial lamb. By 2005, the UFC had entered a new era. The first season of The Ultimate Fighter was about to change the sport forever, launching MMA into mainstream awareness. But in the tightly edited world of reality TV, not everyone was brought on for their championship potential. Some were there to tell a different kind of story. Jason Thacker, known on the show as Strange Brew, was one of them. A quiet, awkward Canadian, Thacker had little in the way of structured MMA training. In fact, as Chuck Mindenhall's in-depth profile would later reveal, he'd been preparing for the show out of an abandoned truck stop with no real coaching staff. By modern standards, he was nowhere near ready for UFC-level competition. But in the logic of reality television, he served a purpose. Cast members and producers alike seemed to know he was a mismatch for almost anyone in the house. Fellow fighters admitted years later that his role was essentially to be a setup opponent. Someone who would lose, and lose early, to establish the show's competitive stakes. Unfortunately, that's exactly how it played out. Thacker faced Chris Lieben in the very first episode. The fight barely lasted a minute and a half. Lieben swarmed, landed heavy shots, and the referee stepped in for a TKO stoppage. What made the loss worse was the behind-the-scenes treatment. Thacker became a target for pranks and mockery in the house, visibly struggling under the spotlight. It wasn't just a bad fight, it was a rough personal experience that aired to millions.